suspension, fuel system, and air conditioning. Let's get them mocked up.
Banks Built, protected by AMSOIL, with support from Roadster Shop and Nitto.
Hey guys, Gail Banks here. Banks Built is moving to Thursdays, so make sure to like and subscribe and click that notification bell. Okay, Erik, let's see what we got.
So if you guys don't remember from last week, it was me, Gail Banks, and Sean from Empire Fab, essentially going over the game plan for LokJaw. Sean's got to have his hands full, and we need to mock it up for him. So as you can see, we've got some pieces kind of sitting on the engine over there. We're trying to build out to where Sean can essentially take it and build around and start to do all this crazy sheet metal work. We've had a couple boxes sitting around the shop, and I think it's about time we open them up. So let's jump into it. Jesus Christ. So let's start with this big old Ridetech box. All right, looks like receiving already got to it. So Ridetech was started in '96. Back then it was Air Ride Technologies. In 2010, they added coilovers and subsequently changed the name to Ridetech. So right off the bat, we got our big old tank here. For a second it looked like galvanized steel, but no, that's definitely aluminum. All right, look at that. We already got the brackets, so that's one less thing for us to do. That'll go nice right on the frame rails. And then, how does Gail do this? Where does he just sets them off to the side? And then we've got our soft line here. I think we're gonna end up going hard line, strictly for aesthetics sake. Always nice to have some soft line though. Push lock a lot of things around here. Looks like small parts, they're gonna go with, I'm assuming, pumps and solenoids, which probably end up in here. So yeah, I've got our push lock fittings. So one thing to mention as I start opening this stuff is we opted for the 3/8 MPT. So in these kind of systems, you'll see 1/4 inch a lot, and that Duramax is so heavy that we're gonna make use of that 3/8 and be able to actually raise and lower this thing in a decent amount of time, to where, you know, if you're running a aluminum block and you run a 3/8, you're just gonna start running some hydraulics, maybe go to Southeast LA and fit into the local scene there. But 3/8 for us. Looks like we've got pump here. Thomas 12 volt DC pump, 20.5 amps. Pretty typical of this setup. It'll be a nice and reliable piece for us. We've used this in early water meth kits and stuff of that sort, so they're pretty reliable pieces. And I believe there's, yeah, dual pumps here. So two the same. That'll give us the airflow we need to get that huge Duramax off the ground. All right, so let's get this next guy here. And I think we were setting a single tank at the moment for mock-up, but I know last week we were talking symmetry. We're gonna be running dual pumps for charge air, and I believe the final plan is gonna be dual tanks to maintain that symmetry, and it'll look real nice with that dump bed lifted up. All right, so we've got our 8 solenoids. We've got the big red 4-way control system. Jay and I definitely didn't just look at the instruction manual for this to see how it operates, but I'm new to bags too. I know suspension geometry. Yeah, this is a new world to me, so we're gonna learn together. But let's follow the air. So we've got our tank. Now the dual exhaust and supply is actually for dual tanks. You're gonna have dual pumps or a single pump run into the tank with a check valve in between to, you know, make sure the flow is only going towards the tank. And you've got tank to your supply. So your supply is going to then feed the delivery side. So your delivery is, you got the 4 ports for your 4 bags. And you've got all the solenoids to control them independently of each other. And then on the opposite side, we've got gauge. So this is where your air pressure sensor is gonna come in for each subsequent bag, and you're gonna be able to tell what pressure you have in each bag and make sure they're equal to each other, which is where ride height sensors come in. We'll touch on that in a minute. And then exhaust or venting is essentially how you're able to bleed off pressure in the bag and ultimately lower the vehicle. So if that is incorrect, let me know in the comments. I'm sure bag connoisseurs will be very mad if it is, but I don't know where we're gonna mount this guy yet, but I'm hoping you'll be able to see it when it's all said and done. That's a nice looking piece. All right, we got one left. Got to free up some space here. Let's see what we got. So I'm assuming this is control. Ooh, here we go. So we've been talking to Ridetech, and we've got their latest control interface here. So we got a 3.5-inch touchscreen, got a nice logo on the back there. The first touchscreen, I believe, from Ridetech, and this is going to be the interface that we're ultimately going to have fun with in the truck and be able to drop this thing to the floor. And then we've got the control module here. So this is the brains of the operation. This is ultimately what's going to control everything and go hand in hand with the solenoid setup. And then we've got our nice little pressure sensors. These are actually pretty low profile compared to what I've seen. And I'm assuming the 5th isn't a spare. It's some sort of pressure reference, which at the time I don't know, but we'll soon find out. So let's jump into another smaller Ridetech box here. So we've got, we got the height sensor kit. So what I was told, since I'm new to all this, is that the old school way of controlling or monitoring your bags compared to each other was just off of pressure. So let's say your passenger front bag was at 80 psi, then you would essentially match that psi all the way around for your height control. But that's a recipe for disaster. You're not really measuring a true height. It's just a pressure value in a bag that has its own spring rate, and it's something that was asking to be upgraded. So Ridetech's solution is actually pretty nifty, I think. So this little guy here is your linkage. So all these little Christmas tree looking things can be broken in between these sections, broken, cut, shaped, to fit any setup. It's a very universal system, so you'd cut it at the length you want, shape it around any packaging issues, and use the Christmas tree portions to essentially lock that in. And then you've got your linkage that would follow the travel of the suspension. So yeah, you take this rotary sensor, and so your setup would be, you would take this bottom portion, you'd have it mounted to your lower control arm. Then the upper portion here, the rotary sensor, has this full range, 180-degree range of travel, and that would be hard mounted to, say, your frame rail. So then, once it's all set up, you would have this rotate with your suspension. So that way, the sensor could read exactly where you are in your travel, could correlate it to all the other pieces, and that way you can have a very fine control of your airbags to each other and have a very even ride height as opposed to trying to match pressures. So I think this is a really nifty little solution to ride height. So now we're going to move on to something I'm a little more familiar with and actually have somewhat of a formal education on, which is shocks. So what some of you may not know is that a few years back, Fox acquired Ridetech, and so now essentially a piece like this is the combination of two companies' research and design and experience, which ultimately gives us a really nice piece here. If you guys are familiar with trophy trucks and pre-runners, you've got those huge bypass 4.0, 5.0, just massive shocks. This is not that. It's a tiny little well-packaged piece, but it's monotube. And Ridetech and a lot of companies prefer monotube over the counterpart twin tube for a couple of reasons. The first one being heat dissipation. So the setup in a monotube is one, as you call it, combined chamber. It's a monotube, a mono chamber. So this rod here is going to have a fixed piston on the end with your valving. So one side you're going to have compression valving as it compresses, one side rebound valving as it rebounds. And then you're going to have a floating piston which separates your nitrogen chamber from your oil chamber. Nitrogen being preferred over compressed air because it's going to have better control through temperature ranges that you're going to see as you dissipate heat through something like this. So another big benefit to monotubes is actually your piston sizing. So in a twin tube, your two chambers are essentially within one another. So you have an internal chamber similar to this, to where you've got the fixed shaft and the piston for your oil going back and forth as you cycle. And then you've got a valve at the end here that goes out to your gas bag or your gas chamber, which actually encompasses the entire oil chamber. So what that forces you to do is reduce the size of your oil chamber and reduce your piston size and reduce your oil volume, and that's nothing that you want. It's going to reduce the life of your shock. You're going to have lower volume of oil, so it's going to go bad faster, and being that your oil doesn't have direct contact with the wall that is then seeing the air, it's not going to dissipate heat as well. So with a monotube, you've got the shared chamber, which essentially means that your oil and your nitrogen are both contacting the main body of the shock, and that allows it to dissipate directly to the outside air, as opposed to twin tube. You've got the gas chamber hiding all the oil heat inside and not allowing it to dissipate out nearly as well as a monotube. So this one will last you a lot longer than a twin tube. So if you guys can see that little knob on the top with the writing, that's our adjustability for this guy. So what this little knob allows us to do is adjust the valving, the rebound valving on this guy. And so not only do we have a larger valve, larger piston set up over a twin tube, we also have adjustability so we can dial it into our exact needs for the rebound valving within this piston. So I mean, it's a small little piece, but I mean, the technology that goes into these things is pretty badass. You wouldn't really tell just by looking at it, but this is going to be really nice. I'm excited to get these on the truck. This little box here, once again, receiving has beat me to it and gotten started on the unpackaging for me. So let's see what we got. I'm assuming we've got the pump and the filter in here. Regulator. Okay, so this is part of why we chose Aeromotive. And if you guys saw the engineering unbox video from a while back, Gail went into why we chose both Aeromotive and their brushless system. We tend to put these through their paces. We run these at pretty high pressure, especially on killing a Duramax. I think we were pushing 100 PSI and still flowing a hell of a lot of diesel through it. And basically very few pumps can do that kind of pressure and flow reliably. So here's a big part of the system, the regulator. So this guy is their extreme flow. Well, it doesn't say it, but I'm just going to say it's extreme flow because it's -12 inlet outlets. We've got our references. We'll be able to get a wide pressure range with this guy, anywhere from I think 30 to 120 PSI, depending on the spring. So the spring will live in this upper cap here, and then you'll see this jam nut and stud, and this allows us to essentially change the preload of that spring. And you know, the more preload, the more pressure you have on that, the more pressure you're going to have in the system. But with the combination of that and the -12 ports, you can run really high pressures and really high flows, which is exactly what we're looking for. So this huge filter, let me take this guy out so you can see, is -16. Yeah, -16. So this guy is great for two reasons. One, it's microglass. Yeah, 10 microns, so post-filtration, threaded cap, so we can change the element on the inside. And the beauty of this massive piece is pressure drop. When we're running any sort of internal flow system, a big thing that Gail likes to touch on is pressure drop. The more pressure we can retain through the system, the better. Combined with keeping the lines as short as possible and having low pressure drop pieces like this helps us retain the pressure that we're seeing right at the outlet of the pump all the way to the inlet at the engine. So we want to try to reduce the pressure drop as much as we can, and this guy will definitely help with that. Here, this will give you an idea of just how big this filter. I mean, hell, I've seen oil filters well below this size. I mean, I think that speaks for itself right there. And the microglass media, I mean, we've done some data deep dives on this for not only fuel but oil, and yeah, this is what you want filtering your fluids. That's awesome. And now let's jump into the big box, which is I'm stoked about because that means I don't have to weld up a fuel cell. Don't get me wrong, I want to, but aluminum gives me headaches sometimes. I'll tell you right away, as a welder, when I see stuff like this, the first thing I always notice is weld quality. And I gotta admit, I'm pretty damn impressed. Aluminum, part of why I said that It's one less thing for me to weld. Is aluminum, in my opinion, is the hardest of the big three: mild steel, aluminum, and stainless. Aluminum is very temperamental when it comes to heat. It's really easy to go too cold, go too hot on your welds. That combined with frequency, essentially there's no beating around it if you can't weld. And the guys at Aeromotive know what they're doing. So this is the biggest fuel cell Aeromotive has to offer, the 20-gallon complete kit. Basically the same exact pump we were running a few hours ago in our dyno cells, and the same pump that we used in Killing Duramax and did just over 1,000 horsepower and ready to go beyond. So we know it works and we're sticking with it. Let's take a look at the baffling in here. So baffling, for those of you who don't know, is essentially to reduce the sloshing of the fuel so that if we're doing, really high G corners in our autocross racer, we won't have fuel starvation. And fuel starvation, and we'll always have fuel feeding the pump as we drop in fuel level. And that's part of why we're going to a 20-gallon tank. We're gonna have an efficient Duramax, but we're trying to drive this thing to shows and not just have it trailered and covered. So we need fuel. This is a brushless pump. Brushless is what you want over brushed in the DC pump scenario because they're more efficient and they will last longer. There are no carbon brushes to wear out, so it's one less component to fail. One, maybe you could call a downside of brushless, is you need control once the brushes are removed, but that's where Aeromotive comes in and they do their true variable speed control. So what that allows them to do is essentially take this yellow wire here, so we got a power ground, and then this allows us to grab a reference, 0 to 5 volt, we could even do a throttle position sensor, and essentially we'll adjust how hard the pump is working based on the demand for fuel. So instead of idling with the pump going full song, overheating the fuel, it'll dial it back and it'll have a variable control based on the demand for fuel at that given time. So I'm pretty stoked on this thing, and they did something that I love when manufacturers do, is they gave us CAD of this guy. So along with what we can get from Roadster Shop and what Aeromotive supplied, that allows us to go in, design bracketry in SolidWorks, and then essentially we can plasma cut it out, bend it, do whatever we need, weld it on, and trust that it's going to fit the first time and we won't have to cut them off and do it over again. I'm sweating right now because we're California in the summer, so we're going to need AC. And I am a newbie when it comes to universal AC, so we're just going to roll with it. And right off the bat, I see bulkhead. Now the beauty of the bulkhead is going to be mounting. So what this allows us to do is mount this right on the firewall and have a spot for Sean to work around. So essentially, this flat portion will go right up against the firewall, and we'll have the inboard and outboard fittings tied down to one location on the firewall and keep it nice and clean, and have a dedicated spot for these fittings and less for Sean to work around when he's trying to package a lot of into that engine bay. So it looks like we got the bulkhead, some fittings to go with the bulkhead, plenty of fittings, pressure sensor. Let's take a look at this first one here. All right, we've got our soft hoses and more fittings. That'll be nice and compliant for Sean to be able to work around that mounting. We've got our compressor here. So if you've seen our Super Turbo, you know we're no stranger to crazy and complicated drive assemblies. So what this is going to allow us to do is mock it up on the engine back there and figure out where it's going to live, what kind of belts we're going to need, and one less thing out of the way, and figure it out for Sean when he goes to build around all this stuff. We got the Magnum mock-up unit. So with mock-up, we were talking to the guys at Vintage Air, and we were trying to figure out, what we need from them. And we go, okay, yeah, our truck had air from factory, and they go, your truck had what? And apparently, factory AC was a very rare option back in 65, 66. So we're gonna end up actually shipping them our vents on the dashboard so they can go through and do a ducting kit for us. And then this Magnum mock-up unit is what's going to live under the dashboard. I mean, we don't really plan on trailering this thing. We're going to be driving it to Lone Star Throwdown. We're going to be Daytona Truck Meet and Florida. We're going to need AC for those trips. We're going probably around this time next year, do some summer drives, and summer drives with no AC in California, Florida, Texas. That's not fun. That is not fun. Yeah, so what would ultimately live in here would probably, you got motor, whatever, filtration, fans, and then ducting out to wherever you're going to end up running this thing. But for us, it's just an empty shell, so we can put it where it's going to live and get everything figured out, along with some mounting bracketry, of course. So we've got a lot of mock-up parts here, a lot to bolt on, a lot to test fit, but in order to get started, we need to get the body off of that, we'll call it slightly rotted frame, and onto the beautiful Roadster Shop chassis. I got to go order probably some fresh Sawzall blades, maybe a little penetrating oil, and a couple cases of beer. I think we'll have a busy weekend ahead of us.
Out with the old, in with the new. In the next episode, the guys strip down LokJaw.